Hello, I'm Kendra, and this is Political Grief. So, I founded the Center for Counseling and Applied Thanatology because I want to do work that is focused around grief and death and dying. And right now, one of the major things that is showing up for a lot of people is actually political grief. Political grief is huge. And it affects all of us. It affects everybody on any side of whatever political spectrum you're imagining. So, yes, this is me. I am the founder of the Center for Counseling and Applied Thanatology. And it's important to note that this is not therapy. It can be very difficult to think about all of this stuff. These are often talks that I hold in person, and I encourage people to pay attention to how activated they're getting because it's hard to talk about grief and it's hard to talk about politics. And I'm asking you to think about both of those at the same time. So feel free to pause this or put it on at a time when it serves you best. My plan for us is that I'm going to define political grief. I'm going to explore secondary losses and we'll cover what that means. And we're going to learn a little bit about how to move through the grief with community, belonging, and memorialization, along with a sense of purpose, because that really is a lot of what is missing these days. So, this is not my quote, this is something that I found. Political grief represents a complex emotional, social, and spiritual response to significant political events that disrupts individuals, families, communities, nations, and identities. I like this definition. I think it is widely encompassing. The only thing that I might add to this is that grief itself has a lot of components, and that includes, of course, emotional, social, and spiritual responses, but it also includes physical responses. Many people in grief feel physical pain. There's also a cognitive component where it can be very difficult to focus. And all of that, I think, needs to be included when we're talking about political grief. So I might adjust this to just say that political grief is a complex series of responses, grief responses. Other than that, I do really like this definition. When I'm in person, I usually take a moment and ask people what they think and what's their reaction to this. So if it feels good, take a minute and check in, see what resonates with you about any of the feelings that you've been having or the responses that you've been having to political events. Does this resonate? Now, we'll talk a little bit about different kinds of grief. There are many kinds of grief according to the literature, and these are ones that I highlight because they show up when we're talking about political grief. Disenfranchised grief happens when our grief is ignored or downplayed. That is obviously something that happens when we are talking about political grief. If we're trying to have a conversation with someone who does not have the same emotional response, does not feel the same losses that we feel, then our grief is going to be disenfranchised. Suffocated grief is similar. It's when our expressions of grief are deemed too much or inappropriate. So this also happens a lot in political grief, that the idea that there's a wrong way to express your grief. It means that we stifle it and it becomes suffocated. Ambiguous loss is what happens when there isn't a distinct loss, when it's incomplete or uncertain. And that I think is something that happens again a lot when we're talking about political grief. There is not often, and especially right now, a single event or a single loss for us to identify. It becomes ambiguous. There's this feeling of loss and grief, but nothing that we can really point to in the way that we can point to a death loss. So, ambiguous loss, suffocated grief, disenfranchised grief are all things that show up in political grief. And I highlight these not to become too academic, but because I think it is actually very important for us to name things, right? If we can sort of define what's going on, it can help us understand ourselves a little bit better and also to feel less alone. So, if any of these things are happening, that there's a name for it. That means it happens frequently enough that people who study grief and who write about grief and who work to help people manage grief have a name for it. You are not alone in any of these feelings. Political grief is also not new. It can feel overwhelming because it is so forefront right now. It is just what is happening all the time that we are in this state of political grief. But the truth is, it's not new, and it's probably not the first time that you have experienced some kind of political grief either. For me, I think one of the first times that I experienced political grief was when I was 17, and there was a presidential election that did not go the way that I wanted it to. The person that I would have voted for, if I had been able to, did not win. And that made it hard for me to feel like the system was on my side or that the adults that I wanted to um, look up to were on my side. It also was very difficult for me because I was 17. I felt so powerless in that particular moment. Um, and I think that that was probably the first time that I experienced political grief. So, again, when I'm in person, this becomes a conversation, but I encourage you to think about an early memory that you have of political grief. When we use this skill and don't think about what's happening right now, we think about an earlier memory, it can be easier for us to get some distance and also look very closely at that memory. Easier than trying to process exactly what's happening right now. So, what you might do is think about an early memory that you have of political grief and how it impacted you and how it impacted those around you. We'll get more into the kinds of things that get impacted, the ways that people and communities are impacted by grief. But before we do that, maybe take a moment to think about your own life and see if you can come up with what has been happening for you. So now we'll get into primary and secondary losses. This is probably not a term that you're familiar with unless you have studied grief in the way that I have, but a primary loss represents the main loss. So when we're talking about, for example, an individual who has died, that tends to represent the primary loss. But in this case, we might also be thinking about a war or a law enacted or rescinded. When I shared about the early memory that I have of political grief, it was the result of a particular election. So that really represented the primary loss. But then there are secondary losses. These are all of the other losses that are related to the primary loss. When a person dies, this can be the loss not only of that person, which would be the primary loss, but losses around my own identity in comparison to that person. If that person was um, a mother or father, then maybe my identity as a child would be lost because of that. If it was instead a child of mine, then my identity as a parent could be lost. There's other secondary losses as well. They can be financial or spiritual or um, all sorts of things. So it's again when we're thinking about how to name things appropriately, it's helpful to look at both primary losses and secondary losses. And I'll go back to my own example. The primary loss, the primary loss in that political grief for me was an election that I didn't agree with. But the secondary losses were the ones that I mentioned earlier, the loss of feeling protected by the adults around me or the adults in the country, a loss of feeling connected to people. So there are a variety of losses that fit into that secondary loss category. Secondary losses in political grief could include things like loss of the assumptive world. That means I used to think that I understood what this world was. I assumed that the world was a certain way, and I can no longer assume that. Loss of assumptive world is a really difficult thing. Loss of safety, loss of identity, loss of hope, loss of faith in a process or faith in systems, loss of real relationships. That's one that comes up a great deal these days with division within families and within friendships around political choices and political beliefs. Loss of real rights and freedoms, loss of access to resources and social supports. I am sure that you can think of more. But again, it can be helpful to name some of these things when we're feeling incredibly overwhelmed by all of the things that are going on. It can help to narrow the focus in the same way that it can be really overwhelming to have a huge project, and breaking it down into smaller pieces makes it feel more manageable. Focusing perhaps on which of these losses can I focus on today can be very helpful. And then reactions that we have, right? So grief is all of the reactions to loss. Reactions that we might have to political losses would include ontological insecurity, which is a very fancy phrase that really means I don't know what any of this is or what's going on at all. Alienation, so feeling very disconnected from others around us. Anger, sadness, disillusionment, and numbness. I highlight numbness whenever I talk about grief because it's one of those that we often feel and become very scared that it's not right. We think that grief means sadness. So when we're not feeling sad, and in fact, when we're not feeling anything at all, it can become very scary. Numbness is a normal and common reaction to all kinds of grief, especially political grief. Political grief has a generational impact where losses include cultural erasure, loss of land, loss of community, and loss of language that can span generations. And it is important to note that grief is political. The list that I shared earlier of types of grief included when grief is suffocated, when we're told that it's wrong. So if I am grieving a loss that others refuse to recognize because of a political system, that is a suffocated grief. How we grieve, when we grieve, and what we are allowed to grieve is political. So it's sort of this full circle thing, right? We're feeling political grief, and also our grief is political. The dual process model is one of the things that I come back to frequently when thinking about grief and when teaching about grief. It is a great way of expressing what really happens during the grieving process. And while most people know about Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, most people don't know that Kubler-Ross developed those stages of grief around personal terminal diagnoses. So those were the stages that she found people went through when they were coming to terms with their own imminent death, which is different from the process of um, feeling a loss and having all sorts of time to deal with that loss. That is the dual process model. So the dual process model represents not only how we grieve, but it actually has been shown to help us grieve when we are following the dual process model, which comes very naturally. It is a representation of processing grief. So, what is the dual process model? The dual process model tells us that we have two buckets of things that we are um, thinking about during grief. We have loss-oriented tasks on the one hand, which focus on loss, feeling the grief, reminiscing, disengaging from the real world, and restoration-oriented tasks on the other side. Restoration-oriented tasks are those that focus on what is happening now and building our future. And what's important about the dual process model is that we have to go back and forth between these two sets of tasks. It is impossible for us to feel all of the sadness all at once and then move into restoration. But it's also impossible for us to ignore all of the loss-oriented tasks and move straight to restoration. So these these two sort of buckets of tasks that we move back and forth from, how we're moving back and forth, and the level of um, control, but I hate the word control when we talk about mental health, but our ability to move in and out of those tasks and to spend a certain amount of time that we choose to spend on those tasks, that's what changes over time. And that's what tells us that we are processing the grief, that it feels less like a roller coaster that we are unaware of, or a raging storm on the ocean, and a little bit more like a decision that we make. So we may find early on in our grieving process, for example, that we spend days in bed. And later on, we may find that we suddenly spent the entire day without crying, without thinking about a loss at all. And both of those things can feel unsettling and scary because we don't understand that the back and forth is inevitable. So just because I'm spending a couple of days in bed doesn't mean that that's the rest of my life. And just because I forgot the loss today doesn't mean that I have forgotten the loss entirely. We move back and forth. And our ability, like I said, to choose spending time on each of those tasks will change over time. So I like to apply the dual process model whenever possible when we're talking about grief. And let's look at how it can be applied to political grief. So things that would fall into that bucket of loss-oriented tasks would be spending time thinking about and feeling the actual emotions that are coming up related to the losses that we've established, both primary losses and the secondary losses related to political grief that we're feeling. Maybe we find ourselves looking back on, quote, better times, or even times when we were not quite so scared or quite so confused about what was going on. This backward looking and reminiscing is indicative of a loss-oriented task. It's possible too that pulling on the grief happens when we're reading the news, that we're reinforcing a lot of those feelings that we have, whether they're sadness or fear or even numbness. How is my engagement with the news cycle contributing to that? And it's possible that that goes into the loss-oriented bucket, but maybe at times or for certain people, it also lives in the restoration-oriented tasks because it's what's happening right now. Reading, remembering, and speaking about history, I also put into the loss-oriented task bucket. Anything that's really focused on the past or focused on the grief. And then there's restoration-oriented tasks. How do we find our footing enough to think about the future and to think about what's happening right now in a way that allows us to think about the future? So engaging in things that are joyful and engaging with others, with our community. Political grief in, I think, an even more powerful way than an individual death loss. Political grief is a communal act. And because it affects community so much, it is healed in community as well. So engaging in things that are joyful and engaging with community toward your future can be very powerful. Working to build the world you would like to see. Again, that's likely something that's going to require more than just you. This is a multi-person endeavor, community engagement. And then offering your skills and your unique skills and support to what I call the ecosystem. It's not just me that says that, but there, it's important, I think, when we're thinking about political grief to understand that the community being affected and the world that we assumed would exist and has been lost for now, that is built and maintained by a variety of different people with a variety of different roles. I cannot do all of the things by myself. I am not all of those roles, the role of community healer or um, individual healer or historian or builder or fighter on the front lines. These are all different kinds of roles. So, understanding what your unique skills might be and offering them to the ecosystem is building the world that you are hoping to see. And it's important to know that some things don't fit neatly into either bucket. So what do you do with that? Maybe like reading the news, at times it is one thing, at times it is another thing. So understanding where things are and where they fall for you in a particular moment will be helpful for you to recognize, am I loss oriented right now? Am I restoration oriented right now? And then, of course, how do I feel about that? Am I able right now to choose between those? Or am I in a state of grief where I don't have a choice and I have to ride it out, knowing that I will move into the other set of tasks at a later time? Another thing that is really important in the grieving process is our continuing bonds. So, when an individual dies, we continue to have some kind of bond often with that individual, um, whether we're the kind of person who sets up a shrine in our home, which is common for many people who are practicing Buddhists, or if we attend Day of the Dead, which is common for Latin American and Latinx individuals, or if we're Jewish and we light yahrzeit candles every year, there is often a memorialization that lasts longer than a single event. Um, I can think also of just the fact that many people use headstones at grave sites. This is a memorialization that we can return to. And political grief is no different. There are memorials for political events. Wars often have a memorial, especially around here in DC, where I am based. So, memorialization and community are both incredibly important for examining and also resolving some of these grieving processes. Political grief is communal, like I said, so memorialization requires community. The large political memorials that we often see cannot be created by one person. Um, a vigil is a communal event, for example. Identity-based losses. So when we're thinking about, for example, many people right now say that they used to be a Democrat or they used to be a Republican, but they can no longer claim those identities because of the way that the political sphere in the United States looks. So that is an identity-based loss. I used to have a name and a category that I fell into, and I no longer do. Identity-based losses can be acknowledged and sort of resolved in community as well. If I have gotten to a place where I don't know who I am anymore because my identity was based on something that I have lost, my community can help me understand. Community is one of the ways that we shape our identity. And it is an important aspect to belonging. Identity-based losses often come with a feeling of not belonging. So finding community can help establish, recreate belonging. And then ontological insecurity, that's the what even is all of this, right? Ontological insecurity is combated through meaning making. So in when we're feeling like we don't understand anything that's going on, we often don't understand what the point is to anything. Creating meaning and building purpose is the way that we fight that. I cannot tell you what your meaning is, but you might be able to identify what helps you feel like your day has been meaningful. or your time has been meaningful. And again, in community, because political grief is something that affects large scale communities, doing that in community is important. Memorialization is a way for us to continue remembering. We're sort of going back to that dual process model, right? Where the truth of grief is that it does not end. We don't get to a place where we no longer focus on the losses. We just get to a place where we have the ability to choose when to do that. Maybe it's been years since you made your grandmother's favorite pie recipe, but today you want to do it. And instead of that recipe card bringing you to tears and making it impossible for you to do anything for the rest of the day, you can feel a little bit sad and still engage. The same thing is true with all memorialization um, and and all losses. Our ability to understand that we don't have the choice to completely forget. That's not the point of grief processing. The point is that we don't forget, and instead we get to remember and move forward at the same time. So it can be helpful to sort of think about when we're talking about political grief and understanding this is not a new process. What political memorials have you been to? What have they meant to you? Um, is there something that you feel was impactful to you in the past that might be able to be impactful again today to help you with your current grief? And of course, no one likes to hear that grief is not something that ends. We want our forward movement and our restoration, and we get it. We absolutely do. So I think it's important, briefly, to note that post-traumatic growth is not a guarantee, but it is possible. It is a real thing that exists. Um, what can happen for many people who experience a major trauma, whether that is a grief loss or some other kind of traumatic situation, is that when they move through that, when they're able to get to the other side includes a, a newfound ability to live life in a positive way, in an increased positive way. Post-traumatic growth. So we find that people embrace new opportunities more, that some people form stronger relationships, have a better sense of resiliency and more appreciation for life, and even deepening spirituality because of the trauma. So again, this isn't a guarantee, but it is a hopeful inclusion here. At times when we are inside the trauma and inside the grief, we don't see that forward momentum. We don't see what it could look like on the other side. But um, you may know someone or have heard stories about someone who lost a child or lost something incredibly valuable and important to them and went on to create a foundation in their name to make their life mission about helping others in similar circumstances that they went through or preventing the kind of loss and trauma that they went through. That can only happen because of that initial loss. Those people would not have been able to do that otherwise. They would not have made that choice otherwise. So I think it's important to recognize that that is, while not guaranteed, an option for our futures. And and it's also important to look at, again, our own abilities, our our growth through this and our ability to find forward momentum and focus on the future is going to be dependent upon our unique skills, what we bring to a community, and how we can move forward using those strengths. So, I did not fix your problems today, but I hope that you found this useful. Please ignore my old timing on some of these other grief and death education series things. Um, I really appreciate you taking the time to spend here listening to me. Um, I hope that you did get something useful out of this and that you can move forward and also exist in a space of loss and that you have community around you that can help you do it. And if you are at all interested in any of the other work that I'm doing, please don't hesitate to reach out.